Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Casper, the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you tonight for our panel discussion on poets on criticism. Before we begin, let me mention a bit about the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress. We are the home of the U.S. Poet Laureate, and we put on literary readings, lectures, and panels of all sorts throughout the year. If you'd like to find out more about events like this, you can add your name to the email list, which is right outside in the foyer. You can also check out our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. And now, let me tell you about tonight's event. And before I begin my formal introduction to tonight's event, I would like to let you know that I know it will go well because we were all together beforehand, and these three talked me into breaking open the bottle of Phil Levine wine, which has been sitting on my desk for over 5 years.
Only a sip.
A sip or two. The Library of Congress is a proud partner with the Bagley Wright Lecture Series, and over the past 4 years, we've featured 6 contemporary American poets in the series, including Srikanth Reddy, who began his lectureship by talking about the insignificant in September of 2015. Srikanth and Maureen also participated in a pair of events I moderated about a decade ago called Critical Contexts, Roundtable on Contemporary American Poetry at Harvard University Library's Woodbury Poetry Room. If the Critical Context Roundtables and the Bagley Wright series offered audiences an opportunity to focus on contemporary poetry and poetry criticism, tonight's event takes a broad, though complementary view. Together, we will explore the tradition of poets as critics, talk about the necessity of poet critics in arguing for poetry to both specialized and general audiences, and discuss the challenges poetry and poetry criticism faces, and how poet critics may best address those challenges. We will also leave time at the end of the event for you to ask questions. I should note, though, that this event is being videotaped, and by participating in the Q&A session, you give us permission to feature you in the webcast. To begin, I have asked each of our 3 participants to briefly and informally introduce a past poet critic who inspired them. And I would like to begin with Matthew Zapruder. You can read about Matthew, as well as Maureen and Srikanth, in your print program, and they should be on your chairs. All 3 are among our finest poets and critics. Additionally, as the founding director of the Bagley Wright Lecture Series, Matthew has made, I would argue, an essential contribution to American letters. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm just going to talk briefly. First of all, thank you, Rob, and thank you to the Library of Congress on behalf of all of us, and also the Bagley Wright Lecture Series, which is named after the publisher of Wave Books, where I'm also an editor. Is Charlie Wright, and his father was named Bagley Wright, and he was a art collector, philanthropist from the Pacific Northwest, and after he passed away, this series was named after him, and basically what came about because I was doing a separate project. I was writing a book about reading poetry, how to read poetry and why to read poetry. It's called Why Poetry, and in the process of doing so, I was reading a lot of criticism about poetry, trying to sort of get familiar with the literature of what had happened before, as far back as I could go, and I noticed right away that a couple of things. First of all, that a lot of the most lasting written contributions to the history of poetry criticism were actually written by poets, although there are exceptions, of course. And the second thing I noticed is that many of them were originally delivered as lectures in front of general audiences, and this interested me greatly, and I started to think about why that might be, what it was about what happened when a poet stood up in front of a group of people and tried to articulate something about poetry in a live setting in front of like actual human beings, as opposed to writing something at one's desk. And Yeah, so I started thinking about this and eventually ended up talking with the publisher of Wave Books, Charlie Wright, about establishing this lecture series to support poets in doing, and creating new works of lasting literary merit that originated in lectures, speaking in front of an audience. So that's what that Bagley Wright lecture series is, and we can talk more about that if you want. But so Rob asked me to each of us to talk a little bit about a poet critic who influenced us or mattered to us or whatever, and I have, of course, a long list. But the first name that came to mind, and I'm just going to quickly mention three, but the first name that came to mind was Wallace Stevens. His work in The Necessary Angel, which is a collection of his essays, all of those are actually, I believe, were originally lectures, public lectures, and there's one in particular, The Noble Rider and the Sound of Words, in which he talks about a concept called the pressure of the real, which I think all of us should be quite familiar with, which is and he gave this lecture right on the eve of the United States entry into World War II, and he talks about how the pressure of the real is so immense upon us, and that the only way that we can push back against it is through a kind of violence of the imagination, which takes place in poetry. It's sort of an aggressive pushing back against this constant inflow of news and information and this overwhelming kind of like thing that's coming at us, which, it's laughable that, the proportion that he had to deal with versus what we have to deal with. So anyway, so that's one person, and just I'll quickly touch on two others before I turn it over to Maureen and Srikanth. Another is a huge influence was Lorca, his theory and function of the duende, and also imagination, inspiration, evasion, and other lectures. Those were originally public lectures that he gave multiple times, both in Spain and in the United States and in elsewhere. And those lectures were so important to me. The concept of the duende is such an important concept for American poets, and in fact is the title of one of the books of our current poet laureate, Tracy K. Smith. And so he's a poet and a lecturer and a critic who I think about a lot. And the third is actually someone more recently who I've gotten to know, the work of Audre Lorde. Many of her critical statements were also originally given as lectures, and I would just recommend one which is called Poetry is Not a Luxury, that was delivered as a talk in front of a feminist symposium, and it's just this perfect short talk about why poems are a necessity. It's from a particularly feminist perspective, so it's kind of odd to read it as like a dude, but it still has. Well, it felt odd to me to read, but it's also, it contains a lot of deeper wisdom for anyone about poetry. So anyway, that's not one but three. Sorry, so I'll turn it over to Maureen and she can go from there.
I would, in a way, echo some of what Matthew has already brought to the table, and also want to thank Rob and the Library of Congress for hosting us, and also Matthew for his imagination with Charles Wright for the whole Bagley Wright lecture series, and for this kind of conversation. So it's a great honor to be invited. And I'll probably follow Matthew as well. It was hard to pick one, but just throwing out a few names and works that came to mind given Rob's prompt. And I spent a lot of time in earlier periods of poetries in English, particularly the British Romantic period. And poets in that moment have meant a lot to me. In particular, Percy Shelley and Keats have mattered a lot to me. And when I was starting to read poetry seriously, and also had some fabulous teachers, all of whom were critics, or most of whom were critics as well, they put in my purview some amazing books and anthologies, and I'm a big believer in anthologies as gateways to all kinds of things. They certainly were for me fascinating. How does one even begin to think about, or how do people even talk about this stuff? And some gateway anthologies for me introduced by the recently deceased poet and critic and memoirist William Corbett, who was based in Boston 30 years and moved to Brooklyn about 5 years ago. Wonderful poet and critic. And he had us read a landmark 1960 anthology called, what was it called? The New American Poetry,
New American,
right?
yep.
And then it got retitled The Postmoderns. And it was a landmark publication that included a lot of the folks who are now known in a kind of experimental wing in American poetry. Everybody from Ginsberg to Frank O'Hara to Denise Levertov to all kinds of great people. And also anthologized were some of their critical statements, including Charles Olson, who some people say invented the term postmodernism by a poet and not by, a journalist or kind of Marxist theorist. But they were just really interesting and also user-friendly to walk into an anthology and have, say, 500 to 1,000 words by a poet and what he or she was up to and how he or she thought about their work. So that, in a way, is a kind of umbrella space through which I encountered, say, an essay I know matters to Rob, Frank O'Hara's Personism, which is very funny and very short and full of little aphorisms, including, basically, if you can call somebody up on the phone, call them up on the phone, don't write them a poem, which I kind of love. I'm botching the elegance of his language. But as I was reading around over time, I found myself more and more interested in the way poets thought about their art in the context of social life and democracy and the pressure of the real, and how does one make a space for thinking and feeling that isn't always squashed in advance. And for me, poetry is one space that has held that openness for me. And what I found more and more was that those kinds of questions press themselves historically first, I would argue, on poets in the late 18th century, in the kind of moment of the onslaught of industrialization and mechanization. And so a poet who I think really got this and wrote about it interestingly was Percy Shelley. And there's a movie coming out called Peterloo, which is about a massacre in 1819 in England of government troops against labor demonstrators. But in the trailer, should you come across it, there are, and I don't know the term for this, the little words that flash. Yeah, thank you. They quote Shelley, and one of the quotes is, "Ye are many, they are few," And so Shelley was trying to think hard about, exactly, he was trying to think hard about poetry, creativity, and democracy. And so his essay, not the Spirit of the Age, A Defense of Poetry, is a wonderful essay, itself part of a genealogy going back to Philip Sidney, Defenses of Poetry. Matthew has just written, one might say, a brilliant defense of poetry in his book. And Shelley's essay, it's very high-flying. It's very, he doesn't give you readings of poems. It's sort of, it literally begins with something like, from the birth of the world and the youth of man, human beings have danced and sung and created. So he has this anthropological notion of what humans as a species do, and that we are a creative species, and that poetry is a subset of our creativity. And how does one think about changes in poetry over millennia? But I think it's an extremely beautiful essay, and it's an essay written under the pressure of the real. It's quite an abstract essay. And that's, as a counter to that level of abstraction, I have always liked some of Ezra Pound's essays, which are, and for some people, they're like, "Ugh, Ezra Pound, put him in the trash bin." We can have that conversation. He had some really wonderful earlier essays, Do's and Don'ts of Reading, an essay called A Retrospect, where he's talking about the new poetry that should be alive to the conditions of modern life, not riddled with abstractions, not composed, as he said, in the sequence of a metronome, that it should have a more musical phrase behind it. So I think he's funny, and he's savage, and he also gives you actual meat. He gives you some actual poems, and he says, "This is terrible, this is good," right? So that's a different way of thinking about criticism, the evaluative. And Pound is really willing to evaluate, and what we would say now in a Facebook, like-unlike way, which I do think is a massive degradation of Critical Horizons. We could talk about that. And I would second everybody Matthew mentioned as people important and formative, and I would maybe throw into the mix too an interesting writer like Anne Carson, whose works toggle between critical prose, translation, quote, original work. She herself is a classicist, so she's bringing to bear a long history from 5th century BCE Athens, and what counted as poetry then included tragedy, to our own moment. And so the idea that criticism can live in many different spaces, on websites, in newspapers, in surprising essays, and in poetry as well.
Well, I'm glad and a little annoyed that you mentioned Anne Carson. But first,
we didn't check in advance,
we
clearly.
didn't. Too much Philip Levine wine. But thank you all for coming to what's possibly the least sexy title for a panel
It's true.
imaginable. But actually, really, I think deeply compelling question facing us right now. And I thought it was kind of interesting that you guys didn't talk about the kind of poet critics who fall under the least sexiest possible version of poet critics, which is the kind of like, don't like arbiters that I automatically think of when I think of poet critic. So, I don't have a axe to grind with Randall Jarrell, but that would be an example of someone who has kind of positioned themselves as a kind of gatekeeper of what was admitted into verse culture and what wasn't. And I think that that's an activity that kind of continues today, for better and for worse. I think there are reasons why the poetry world kind of needs or feels a need for that kind of activity, right? But Anne Carson came to mind as I was thinking about this topic as a contemporary writer, because in a way you wouldn't normally think of her as a poet critic because there's very little published reviews or criticism that she does, but her poetry is deeply involved in a kind of critical activity. And in some ways you could kind of actually think of it as not criticism, but critique. I mean, you can glean moments of criticism in her poetic work where she offers readings of other writers, like Emily Bronte, or even not just other writers, but visual artists like Gordon Matta Clark or Francis Bacon, or philosophers where she examines Husserl's microscript in his notebooks, and of course her classical kind of knowledge. But there's also a way in which I think she does something that you could call kind of poetic criticism, where she shows us that criticism isn't what we thought it was, or critical thought isn't what we thought it was. And that seems to me like kind of the most valuable thing that a poet can bring to kind of the public sphere, in a way, aside from the production of art, right? But I also think that what Carson and probably other poets throughout the tradition can show us is that kind of poetry itself is a deeply critical art. It's an art that kind of has a critique kind of built into it in a kind of immanent kind of way. And I think that's probably why we're so touchy about poetry, and why even in the pedagogical context, when a student writes a poem that's a certain kind of poem, people can feel riled up by it, offended by it, impinged upon by it. I think because every act of writing a poem is a kind of critical act that refers back to the history of the art, right? Or the horizon of possibilities of the art in the present. So I think one way of thinking about what the poet-critic is, one thing we're not talking about so far, and I think I'm glad that we're not talking about critic poets, which is a kind of genre of discourse now. But I think poet critics, in a way, is almost a redundancy in an interesting way, because I think every real poet is kind of doing critique whenever they put pen to paper.
But I'd like to just flip that assertion around and say, what about cultural commentators or journalists,
Yeah.
or scholars who are writing criticism? What might critics who are practicing poets, who identify first and foremost, or begin by identifying as poets, what might they bring to the table in their criticism that you don't see happening with other kinds of critics?
So I don't find much value in it, actually. I used to write reviews, and I very occasionally do sometimes when there's a book that I admire and am thrilled by, and I think that's a really useful activity. Like, so you wrote a review of a book by Anne Boyer a while back that made me look up that book, and I loved that book, and so that was a valuable, thing. But I don't know if you found this, but when I write reviews, I shut off a whole part of my imagination, and I'm writing a kind of a product that is designed to kind of popularize, introduce kind of work to an audience, but I don't feel like I'm actually engaging in kind of creative critique, or a kind of activity that I feel really deeply fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that way? Or I know you write a lot of criticism. Yeah.
I guess I would say first yes, and
Yeah.
secondly, I guess the quote, house of criticism has many mansions.
Yeah,
And I feel like for a lot of people, I don't know. You're both of you are so engaged with various publics. I feel like you would be like living barometers of this, because I do feel my experience is that there might be, say, public streams. Maybe there is a minute on public radio, or maybe there are some there are all kinds of venues, right, for popular poetry. But say you wanted to know what are the young poets in America doing these days? How would you find out about it? And that's one thing, is maybe go to the web, right? All of that's changed.
Yeah.
The media ecology has totally changed, and there's some fascinating things that are web-based critical organs. And I have written a lot of, at a certain point, I wrote more reviews, and partly it was, I'm a friend to the art of describing. I think actually there's a ton of mediocre criticism in the universe, and although there's less and less criticism, there's less and less space devoted. I don't know if, for example, if one tracks, say, the New York Times and how they allocate space, one will have noticed a real contraction, and that they even still have a book review is unusual. All these book reviews have kind of collapsed. So where does criticism happen in our culture, and what is it for? And when I was thinking about this about 10 years ago, when I think I first met Srikanth, actually it was some art historians who were helpful in getting me thinking about this. And this one guy, I might be butchering his name, David Josselet, he said, I think of there being 4 kinds of criticism, and I might not remember this. There's the exploratory, the paradigm marking, like these are the kinds of things, the mnemonic to remember this is a kind of thing, and I can't remember what the third is, which tells you something. And another art historian, Rosalind Krauss, said she always thought the business of a critic was to scan the horizon for blips of the new. And that's, I'm always, I don't feel like that's my vocation in life. I'm really happy that there are people in the world who do it, however. I learn things from critics who are willing to do the work we might associate with journalism, right? Like, here's a new poet, or here's a new work by a poet from Chile, and here's a new work by, and so I think that that's actually extremely important, and that's been a bit strangulated by a number of factors in our life right now, partly speed and pressure. And I think that kind of, in as much as frankly, a lot of journalistic criticism I see is just an extension of blurbing, and I think it's really weak. And so I feel like, for me, a lot of test of things is, can somebody actually accurately describe something even if they hate it? And this is what I say to students. It's like Hazlitt has this great thing about how it's really important to be a good hater. And so I'm super uninterested in the like-unlike paradigm as the end of a conversation. It might be a start of a conversation. There are tons of things I love. There are some things I'm like, There are other things I despise. But I feel if I'm teaching or if I'm writing for other people, I feel like part of my job is to accurately describe it. And of course, one can describe things in a bunch of different ways. One can say, this person is writing about this kind of subject, they're writing in this kind of key, the poets and writers who seem to matter to her are these. And I think that's really important pedagogical work, and it's also, this is how I have found things. I mean, I'm so thrilled, that actually somebody read that review. But it is interesting. It was a case, I actually backed off writing reviews because I felt I did not want to be the village explainer. And I feel that's a temptation. It's like 1,600 words of stuff for people who are not interested in poetry. Yet, I found myself endlessly galvanized by people who do this well. And whether it's about chemistry, whether it's about poetry, whether it's about CRISPR and new gene sequencing, it's like people who are passionate and good writers. One wants people to have the space to do that, and so I'm always very admiring if people take up that gauntlet, but actually describe something well for someone who might be a novice at it.
But I do want to follow up and ask, do you think that the poetry criticism that you feel moves beyond simple blurbing, and that seems engaging and inspiring and exciting? Is it written more often than not by other poets than by critics or cultural commentators or people outside of the poetry world?
I think that's a Venn diagram you've just drawn in the air. One thing I would say, I agree that there is something definitely like the insider's traction with things that poet critics can bring to the table and do. But frankly, I was trying to think of people in younger generations who are critics who are not poets. And I think that's actually a big problem. I think there's a lot of insidery party pre-crapola. I'm being obviously completely non-polemical. But I think actually it would be good if there were some more critics who weren't poets. And I think and there are for complicated reasons in the UK. There are, and that's an interesting thing. And it's partly about how things get segmented in life. Most people who are in a certain tranche will read a novel in the course of 3 to 5 years. But I don't know if you've encountered, poetry phobia, right? It's a very common thing. It's a really common thing. Maybe some of you are poetry phobes, but you're here, And I kind of feel, well, and it's a complicated question, how can one mediate between those who have made it their vocation and those who are passionate readers and not only passionate reader-writers? So I would say yes, I think there's something very special that poet critics bring to the table, and it's very striking that one can name, whether it's somebody like Randall Jarrell, but I think it's very telling that if you talk about, quote, mainstream critics who are over 80, Helen Vendler, who just retired from Harvard, and Marjorie Perloff, who retired from Stanford? Yeah. And they were not poets. And they were... Harold Bloom.
Yes.
And it's very interesting to think of that. There was a whole tranche of people
Yeah.
who wrote on poetry, and one might agree or disagree with their approaches and whom they championed, but there was a sense of describing, at least in Perloff's and Wendler's case, they were interested in fine-grained describing. So this is just more a sociological observation than and it's just sort of interesting. I'm always so cheerful when I find somebody who doesn't identify as a poet and actually wants to write something. It's like, oh great, it's not just, everybody already on the team,
Well, Matthew, Maureen brought up the issue of writing to a general audience, to kind of the village explainer. Maybe you could talk about why poetry and how you're trying to reach a big old village.
And the village idiot.
This is the village explainer.
Yeah, I wrote, well, I mean, I'm just kind of processing a lot of what's been said. I mean, I don't, first of all, really, it's so funny that this conversation kind of veered off into, or became about, like, sort of a more, like, critics who write about poetry, which is interesting. I just didn't even think of that. I just kind of have given up on that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really to put much stock in that. I don't know that, I kind of think when it comes to contemporary poetry, you all are more optimistic than I am, that people can explain a book or demonstrate a book in a venue that would make people want to read it. That's great. I hope that's true, but I sort of more think that poets are better at just reading their poems and having people kind of, I mean, I'm a big believer that if you just let me read poems somewhere, they'll find their audience, and that maybe that goes back to what you had said, Chico, about being, like, poems being kind of their own criticism in a way. Mm-hmm. I'm so interested, though, in what, I guess, poets can say when they try to talk about poetry in a larger sense or in a historical context, or try to position it in relation to other activities. And the book that I wrote was really designed to address what you mentioned as poetry phobia, like this kind of idea that poems are somehow alien to everyday experience, or can't be understood, or aren't written in regular language, or all this kind of bullshit that's, like, not true. And so I wanted to try to just write a book that directly took on those issues. And in that sense, yeah, it's criticism for sure, but it's sort of more like a kind of like autobiographical polemic, I guess I would say, but not really criticism in terms of, like, trying to value what's good and what's bad. I've never really found that much use in that. I mean, I just say for myself, like, I'm early on in my career as a poet, I was writing reviews, which was interesting. And I wrote a bunch of reviews in small magazines. I wrote in Verse magazine. I wrote a lot of essays. And then I was asked to write these reviews for Harvard Review, and they sent me some books, and I hated them. And I wrote these negative reviews, and that was it. I never wrote another review after that, because I just felt like this is just not the position I want to be in relation to the art that I make. I don't feel like being the person who just scolds everybody for doing a bad job. I do it privately all the time, but I don't. But publicly, it just felt bad. It felt like it was killing my own work. So I don't know. I haven't actually weirdly given that much thought to what it would be to write a review in the New York Times magazine, or the book review or whatever. And, like, I guess I just don't really think about that. I think more in terms of this kind of, you brought up Shelley's Defense of Poetry, and it contains that famous remark that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. But before that, he has this amazing description where he says that poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended future, holding up, he describes poets as holding up these giant mirrors to futurity, and the shadows of futurity are cast upon these mirrors. That's what comes right before that famous remark right at the end of the essay. And I've gotten more out of that thought, that idea that poets sort of are instinctively are like mirrors of the future in their poems, and that I have out of any, Marjorie Perloff or Helen Wendler book, and I've read many of them. So I just, that's where I go when I want to get back in touch with poetry, other than poetry itself, is stuff written by poets. Yeah.
It's like, it's kind of like the violence from within versus the violence from without, but it's we're in a situation where it's like criticism from within or the criticism from without the poem, talking about poets writing criticism versus civilians writing criticism, and in a way, I think that the most exciting critical activity happens from within that kind of poetic position, right? So when poets are imagining the possibilities within poetry, right, which quite often happens just within the poem itself, right? So actually, I think Stevens actually does this, with every book, with every poem in a way, at his best. And and I don't want to say people who don't write poetry should not write criticism, right? But there was one funny incident as I was flying over here where the only time I read the New Yorker is on the airplane, and there was a review of, there was a piece about the Aeneid and recent translations of the Aeneid, and the reviewer, I think it was Daniel Mendelsohn, I'm not sure who it was, wrote a very smart, thoughtful piece about the Aeneid, and pointed out all kinds of interesting things, like, for example, the 9/11 memorial has a quotation from the Aeneid that actually in some ways seems to be sympathetic towards a kind of insurgent kind of subject position rather than the empire's positionality. But it was utterly unconvincing as an argument for why anyone should read the Aeneid. I read the piece and I felt like, yeah, but I don't want to read that poem again. It seemed like there was no actual critical activity that talked about the ways that the Aeneid, in some ways, is a failure of the imagination, right? In the ways that the Aeneid is deeply imitative and unoriginal and kind of slavish in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, I'm sounding like very anti-Virgil, but what I mean is
Big
that,
trouble here.
Yeah. I see people walking out, but it's felt like a poetic response to me. It might actually think about like, well, how do you actually talk about the fact that Virgil also rewrites the Shield of Achilles, but it isn't better than the original Shield of Achilles, or that the narrative is very much modeled on on Homer. I feel like a poet writing about it would have actually grappled with that, right? And that's the kind of being on the inside of the art that I think actually like Wendler and Perloff and Bloom, they have amazing taste. And one thing that amazes me about them is that I feel like they're always right about poets. I mean, I love the poets who they love. So I guess there is a way of getting inside of poems without writing them, but it's hard to imagine how that happens.
Let me take a different tack with the conversation. I'm wondering about what it means to have the three of you here talking about the role of poet critics promoting poetry at the Library of Congress, the home of the U.S. Poet Laureate, across the street from the Capitol and the Supreme Court, as an institution that represents something in American life, represents a sort of storehouse of knowledge and creativity. How do you think poets now and going forward can best ensure that not only other poets, but a larger audience sees the great value of poetry, understands how it can matter to their lives, even when those critics might be talking about something difficult or somewhat off-putting, the kind of thing that we hear about all the time when people initially, the poetry phobia that you were talking about.
I'll take that one.
I mean, I think, we have an example of somebody addressing that in the current Poet Laureate, right? Thinking about going to rural communities, if I'm understanding some of what Tracy K. Smith's mandate as Poet Laureate is, and also reinstalling the NPR Poetry Minute. So this sense of something being part of the fabric of every day that might come over the airwaves, and it's like in Vermont, there's the Garden Report, and then there could also be the Poetry Minute, right? So those are some ways that seem to me open and refresh our ears, and it doesn't mean that we might respond or resonate with everything we hear. I mean, on the question of kind of the civic and the kind of public things, I was thinking about, because there was a question of the kind of Americanness of this question or not, and I was thinking about Whitman, and I was thinking about, he has wonderful, amazing critical prose, whether it's Preface to Leaves of Grass or Democratic Vistas, which is a dark and timely thing to read, and but there's an interesting thing that seems sort of baked into American literary culture, arguably, that the criticism, as it were, came before distinctively American poetry. We could fight about this all night. But if one thinks that Emerson wrote, I think it was the essay The Poet, and published it in 1844, where he's calling for, and he says, our hog rollers, our butchers, our, as he said then, Negroes, our Indians, our Kentucky, our Mississippi, they have yet to find their poet. The vast plains of this great country, our cities have yet to find their poet. And this sort of protest against English norms and English models of poetry and English meters and English pastoral and English themes. And arguably, Whitman certainly thought he answered that call, and he sent his book to Emerson for a blurb, and Emerson gave him one, I salute you at the beginning of a great career, or I greet you at the beginning of a great career. So I think there's something, it's kind of an interesting opportunity and a challenge, and maybe a burden, that this sense of, certainly Whitman took on that question of a national poetry and a national poet, and the great poem of these states. What were the poems adequate to these states? Another person I was thinking about in these matters, and it really, I think, speaks to both Srikanth and Matthew's point. William Carlos Williams's book, In the American Grain, is such an interesting, deeply weird prose meditation on the history of America through figures like Eric the Red, the Norwegian explorer, and Abraham Lincoln figured as an old granny, and all of these sort of American icon figures. And he's trying to imagine a counter-America that is made out of Spanish and French explorers and African Americans and Indians, and is not all about Puritans, which was an important intervention to be making in the 1920s. And all of this leads me to a very living poet, John Keane, kind of amazing poet and writer and translator who just won a MacArthur. And he has a book, an essay, it's called Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, where he's calling for a poetry of the Americas that was more interlingual, so that we would have a much, as well as activating the diasporic black traditions in the Americas. And he's asking for more translations of poets of color for centuries who have written in, say, Portuguese, Spanish, French. So I just diverted completely away from Rob's question, but I think this is not a complete divergence, because I think part of the question is about imagined communities and the place poetry might have in reminding us, expanding our notions of that, re-anchoring, making debatable. Part of me, I have to say, also has a slight recoil from this question, because, or the terms of this question, because I also think there is a very important place for the quiet, the private, the unassimilable, the non-clubbable, the non-communal, the non-social, the pre-political, the ontological. And I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the genealogies in U.S. poetry will say, well, there's Dickinson and there's Whitman, and there's, and in a way it's too tidy, but it does tell us something about, there are poetries, there are communities, there are also many languages in this country, and that possibility. I felt so excited when people have introduce me to things, or people who are active translators and who offer other ways of reading when I can discover them. So.
Well, just when you're mentioning Emerson and Whitman, it would be, so I was kind of weirdly arguing against anyone except poets writing about poetry, which doesn't make any sense, because actually I think in some ways it would be great to hear like philosophers write about poetry, and that doesn't happen that much now, and you know, Heidegger, or you know, we need maybe more conceptual thinking about poetry than we have right now. Whereas right now, I think much of the poetry criticism is kind of about popularizing or poetry appreciation, which is an important activity, but I think that there's a dimension that's missing right now.
Well, I have a completely, to be honest, just sitting up here listening, I, as a writer of poetry, I have a completely contradictory set of opinions, which is, on the one hand, I totally resent the idea that my work should be intermediated in any way by a critic. Like, I don't care about what critics have to say about my poetry. I've never read a single review of my work that I found illuminating to me in any way. I don't learn anything from them. I don't really read them anymore. Hardly any, which is an advantage. I resent it. I resent the idea that somebody should be in between me and human beings. On the other hand, I crave somebody saying something interesting and having about not just about my work, but about anybody's work that would be of use to me, or like help me change as a writer and learn something or whatever. And I don't really see very much of that around contemporary poetry right now. I don't know why that is. I think part of it is just because there aren't a lot of venues, widely read venues, in the support for critics. I think it's tough to make a living. If it were ever possible to make a living as a critic, it's pretty tough now, and most people, need to be academics or have some other kind of job. So often my students' papers or review or writings about other poets are super interesting to me, actually, because like that's a time that they just sort of write from their own perspective or whatever. But but as like as a kind of practitioner of the art, like I want to believe that I can make my work and it can directly connect with people, and it doesn't need someone to explain it. That almost feels like that would be kind of failure to me. Like if it needed to be explained by some big brain, by Marjorie Perloff, so that everybody like, oh, that's why it's good. That feels like a little too. That feels like maybe I would have not done a good job as a poet. But like on the other hand, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-intellectual, or like that I'm like think that all poetry should just be like, directly apprehendable or something. So I have mixed feelings.
Maybe the problem is the term explainer, as opposed to helper, as you said, or advocate, or champion. That in a way, the role of the critic, especially a poet critic, is to say, I understand this. I understand what it means to write this. I want you to understand it too, not just intellectually, philosophically, historically, but emotionally.
Can I throw out like a?
You just wrote a book on this. I'm kind
but
of shocked,
can I?
Matthew.
But I didn't write it to like. Yes, you're right.
I don't think any of us is. I
contain
completely
multitudes.
agree. There's also that kind of thinking about things from a reader's perspective, who might, in a way, like, oh, I would love to hear. I was just asking before we formally sat down, like what people are reading and what they like, right? And so that could be a kind of higher order thing rather than. And I completely agree with you, Matthew, that that burden that this is a difficult thing that has to have professional explainers is just the worst, right? But there is something about, which your own book demonstrates, which is, what it is when somebody who is just, passionate and incisive and knowledgeable and inside things can share that with others. I think that's very different from a gatekeeping function or a, seal of approval, and now you have to subscribe to this interpretation of this poem to go to the cocktail party and have something to say about it.
Yeah, well, Rob, you asked like earlier, right on the beginning, you asked like what is missing. I think you have something like, what is missing from critics who don't write poetry. But was that the question? And it's love is what's missing. Poets love poetry, and they write from a position of love, which can often curdle into like total disgust. And And I think what's one thing that is missing from contemporary American criticism right now, poetry criticism right now, is that we live in an environment where it's dangerous to critique things, certain things. And I think that there's a fundamental, just giant yawning absence in the writing about poetry right now. I think that it's not, I don't think, for instance, I can pick somebody whose work I happen to personally love. Terrence Hayes is a wonderful poet. His most recent book is fantastic. I think I can't imagine somebody writing a negative review of that book being published in a major American publication right now. I think it would be risky to the person who wrote it, frankly, because it would be aesthetically, they would be considered like, what's it called, retrograde or conservative or something. So I think I think it's hard to write about art right now in general. So I think that's also something that's going on. So I think it's easier to be, and there's a lot can be said from a positive point of view and from a position of love or whatever. But I think that poets are sort of, I'm thinking about, we're having this conversation, there's a great piece, essay, that I really recommend for its sheer bitterness, which is published in 1960 by Robert Bly. It's called A Wrong Turning in American Poetry, and it's just absolutely vicious. I mean, it goes through like all the major American poets of his time, just dismantles them in the most like exciting way. And it's like, I long for an essay like that now. It'd be amazing to read somebody's.
William Logan doesn't do it for you.
No, it's not really the same because it's too limited. He's just like a bitch about everything. It's like he's not like nice. It doesn't come from this like. Bly writes from this like from deep love. But he's so pissed because like poetry's let him down. That's different. And that's like I just wish somebody would write that. No, I mean, I'm not dumb enough to do it, but like, maybe somebody else on the stage is. But anyway, yes, but like love is the thing. And so like when I wrote my book, like I was out of love for the art, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna try to explain things, but secretly my agenda was to, unexplain everything and get to the end of the book and have it be like about how it is a fundamentally private experience and there's a limit to what can be said about it, but. I don't know where my point was there.
I'm going to see if you have questions, not because I don't, but I want to.
So many other questions.
I have a lot of other questions.
Yes, a lot of great questions.
I have a lot of questions, but I feel like,
So
I
well
want you to ask questions. So, Anya's here with the mic. Who would like to ask a question, please?
Thank you for your panel. I wondered what you all thought about the episode at Nation and Stephanie Burt writing an apology for having published a poem by someone who used another voice than his own. And, there's been a history of persona poems, and Zapruder uses phrases for workers and working, and William Carlos Williams used the language of his poor, homeless, white women. Isn't that okay?
I think that might be a kind of tangential question to the role of poet critics, because though Stephen Burt, actually now Steph Burt, served on the panel that I had, the critical context panel I had with Maureen McLane, she was doing that in her role as editor, and there wasn't much of a critical.
But that is a kind of criticism, though. I mean, you're trying to bail us out of the question, but I'm going to bail us back in.
Yeah.
That is a kind of criticism. Yeah. Editing is a kind of criticism, but just to be fair, the note of apology was actually written by both Stephanie Burt and Carmen Jimenez-Smith, who are both the editors at the Nation magazine. And the poet's name is Anders Carlson Wee, and he wrote a kind of bad poem, basically, from the point of view of a homeless person. And the real problem with the poem is it was kind of a bad poem, actually. It was sort of a dumb poem. The motivation might also be problematic. I can't really speak to that, but I suppose I could imagine in some kind of platonic world somebody writing a good poem from that point of view, but it was sort of a stupid poem that was not very well thought through, in my opinion, having read the poem. And it was just like, I think that was a lot of, had it been better, maybe the conversation might have been more interesting, but it was just not, it was shallow is my point. It's like it didn't really actually sound like a person in that position talking, first of all. And second of all, the point of making that a poem altogether seemed kind of Like, what was the point of doing that? Like, why just sort of, that didn't even seem like like, I don't want to say appropriate, because that sounds too ethical or judgmental, but just useful thing to do as a poem. And so I didn't really I thought they did a bad job at picking that poem, and I thought they should have stuck behind their choice. I thought they threw the poet under the bus, and they shouldn't have done that, because once you pick something, you should stand behind it. It's not right to throw a young poet under the bus, and I'm friends with both those people, but I didn't like what they did, but I also thought the poem was bad. So I thought the whole thing was a mess.
I mean, I think.
That's what I think.
I think, Matthew just very economically laid out a lot of my thought processes. And I do think too, and again, this may be slightly pivoting away from the premises of your question, but I do think this was also something about the temporality of reading, and that there was a kind of Twitter outcry. And I think that there's a sense, I think that was an apology written under enormous pressure. And that is the situation we are in now. We're in a situation of reactivity all the time. And so the space to have a conversation about, and these things are unavoidable and necessary, whether you're talking appropriation, ventriloquism, varieties of American vernacular English, who speaks, who gets to speak. I was quite taken aback, and I thought it was not a helpful comment. Roxane Gay, a writer whom I enormously admire, her response to this was "stay in your lane," and I'm like, wow, So I did feel like, all of us are having inner cops activated a lot, and that's pretty depressing. But it also is sort of where we are, and so I can't help but feel it partly seemed to me like this glorious, horrible symptom of a lot of things, and that the what does one call it? Not even the 24-hour news cycle, but spin cycle was so intense. One can understand why they did write such an apology, but I also thought it was milquetoasty and weird. And I do feel, I think very much that editing and curating and organizing lecture series is a form of criticism. That's why anthologies are so important, and syllabi and all of that. So.
Jump in.
Yeah, but I think that the difference is that the apology was not, I think that as a critic, you can write a strong defense of a poem and then you can change your mind, right? As an editor, you publish a poem.
Right.
And then to kind of retract it is I think it goes against the role one takes on as an editor and pushing forward work that you believe in. So I understood why they had to do it.
Can I just say one quick thing, which is that it's depressing that the amount of time and energy that was devoted to the discussion of this at best mediocre poem was compared to all the other work that has been published recently. It was absurd, and it was depressing as a poet to watch this, because it's just people just cannot stop talking about this, because they love to watch poets misbehave, and people do anything but then actually talk about poetry. So I'm not saying it wasn't an interesting topic of discussion, but it's like even that it became, this conversation was a little like grim to me. I felt like would have preferred something else.
I don't think that makes it easy for someone to ask another question.
Oh, I'm sure everybody will recover.
I didn't read the poem, so I don't know if it's really that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Really
Hi.
enjoyed the discussion, so thank you for that. Maureen, you mentioned Facebook, you called it degradation of critical horizons.
Not Facebook per se, although maybe I'd argue that too.
At least the
Like
uses
and
of
dislike.
Facebook, as far as the type of discussion that it creates in some instances. Either way, it made me think of something that I started thinking about a long time ago, which is that as a mode of communication, I think social media as a whole kind of has this unique place in that it's really been free of any sort of critical treatment, whereas film, television, books, even other magazines and newspapers have always had this sort of sidecar with them, talking about how they function and their uses, whereas social media, which is, we're seeing this, down the street in the White House, is maybe the most powerful form of communication, at least in the last 100 years to come about. And within that realm, now we're seeing the emergence of what's called insta-poets. And I guess my question is twofold, which is, do you see social media as a form of communication that does exist outside the reach of criticism? And if so, how do you handle something like the incredible popularity of poetry through Instagram? We just had an Insta Poet here in DC. She sold out 2 nights at, I think, the Lincoln Theater. And these are people that are getting more reads on an individual poem than probably any poet in this building, you know, on a daily basis. So just what your thoughts are on that, and yeah, any response? Thank you.
I'm agnostic. I'm sort of come all ye, and I sort of feel like I tend to think of not poetry but poetries, and I think that there are lots of different ways that people encounter poems. People write for platforms, people write for communities, people write out of traditions and genealogies. Some of them might be fellow poets, some of them might be thinking with Homer, some of them might be thinking with James Schuyler, some of them might be the interface of poetry and pop music. And I sort of feel like I could have a sociological response to that, which is, mass culture creates new niches for communication. Okay, so I just sort of feel like more power to you, and I also feel, the question, it's a very interesting question too about, as you said, like sidecars going with older media forms, and that there's just probably starting to be a more robust kind of sociological conversation or even an aesthetic conversation about what is the logic of Twitter, or people like tweeting entire novels, or the question of restricted form. Does the 140 character tweet actually lend itself to a possible striking form? So I'm kind of, this is a thing that I don't get my knickers in a twist about. And partly this is a thing where I find consolation in, or if not consolation, maybe provisional balance in thinking about broadside culture and oral tradition and ballad culture and popular poets of the 19th century who somebody like, say, Emerson or Hawthorne would have just been like, ugh, put them in the trash bin. But there are many ways to live in and with verse, and not all poetry is verse, not all verse is poetry. So I'm kind of pivoting away from your question, but I just, I feel like there's a kind of Venn diagram of intersection, and there's like a slim intersection between some of these things and some other matters. I also encounter some very good critical discussions sometimes on Facebook, even though I do feel it's like it rots my brain.
Yeah, that was my question. Is social media offering a new kind of venue for criticism, new ways to think about criticism, or does it just feel like the likes, dislikes predominate?
I'm not on social media, so I'm not very qualified to answer. But maybe that qualifies me to imagine its possibilities in a more utopian or dystopian kind of way as a non-user. And I can imagine that one problem of, you can imagine like Walt Whitman saying Facebook is the greatest poem, and there's all of these immense possibilities, right, in the form. And I can imagine that the 140 character tweet is as compelling formally as the haiku form, or or has potentialities within it that are as compelling as any other formal constraint. But I think that the thing that I would wonder about, and again, I'm not qualified to comment on it because I just have too much of an addictive personality to ever go on social media, is that I think popularity can't be the metric of value. And it seems that...
What?
Yeah. But are there like actual kinds of communities and opportunities or potentialities within social media for more kind of sophisticated ways of thinking about what literary value might be within that formal practice? I don't know.
Yeah, first of all, tweets are now 280. But second of all, an odd thing about, and I'm sure other people in this room have noticed this, but is that, so tweets, when they were 140 characters, that's also the same number of syllable. That would be the exact word and syllabic count of a sonnet, right? So 10 iambic pentameter sonnet would be 10 beats, 14 lines,
Right.
and so that seems like a totally irrelevant coincidence, but I just
Yeah.
thought I would point that out.
Just one last question, right here.
I have found, as in reading criticism by poets, that one of the exciting things in reading a poet critic is not the descriptive and evaluative role that they play, but the prospective role. I think, gosh, going back to Coleridge or before, but also like with Wallace Stevens writing very evocatively, but somewhat unclearly about like the poem of hell, the poem of heaven, and then he starts talking about, well, what does the poem of earth look like, for instance? And as someone who likes also to write poetry, I find that type of phrase that I read in criticism by poets really inspiring and useful, and I wonder if you find it the same way. Are you inspired by criticism of that sort, and do you see a role for this sort of perspective criticism when a poet turns to prose to describe the thing they can't quite achieve in their own art quite yet?
Your question reminds me of Matthew's, very beautiful opening up of Shelley's Defense of Poetry, which ends with this whole question of poetry and futurity, and that whole thing about, what is it, poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration. And it's all about, it's like what is not yet apprehended, what is not yet legislated, what might yet happen. And that's also a key in Emerson, it's like the poem of America does not yet, and it's a call for, and so people talk about a kind of, this is why manifestos, although they can be very dogmatic and they can feel like you're being amputated, but what it is so wonderful when one encounters something that feels enabling or inspiring, and I definitely feel that in a certain key, Shelley is like that, or if you read some of Anne Carson's essays, they open up doors or open up some possibilities that one might not have thought of, and that might be the most, that sense that you would expand your own either thinking or writing or reading practice. I mean, that seems to me the real gift of these kinds of essays, books, etc., when they actually can resonate that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question to end on in a lot of ways. I think the kind of, and prospective would be in some ways like my ideal for what kind of criticism would do, right? Rather than proscriptive. And I don't know that, I think we can have more of that. But that would require also, that requires thinking outside of the 250 word review or, the different kinds of media outlets for criticism. And this is why things like the lecture are a forum for thinking possibilities for poetry. And I think that, that's what the poet critic in some ways, I think would be ideally do.
I mean, when poets write criticism, they use words like hierophant or luxury or nobility
Negative
or duende,
capability.
negative capability, which was in a letter that Keats wrote to his brothers. And they write those words because they are poets and they can't help but ultimately be preoccupied with the texture and possibilities of language, and probably words that they have an instinct apply, but they're not totally sure. And a lot of the criticism written by poets is kind of often is a sort of exploration of the use or association of a certain word with importance, and a kind of instinctive choice that's then justified in the course of the essay or the lecture. And that's just not how academics and generally write criticism. They have a different way of approaching the work. And so that's probably why I like criticism written by poets better, because it operates in a kind of way that poems operate too. It comes out of a love of, not just of poetry, like some kind of weird abstract thing, but out of a love of language and words. And those are the most memorable moments to me, and I think they've had a profound influence on our thinking about poetry, actually. You brought up Coleridge, but Wordsworth's Introduction to the Lyrical Ballads in 1799 is the single most important poetic statement that was made for a long time. It's deeply influenced even today our ideas about. I mean, if you read that, you see general ideas about poetry and what people think, and this is meaningful work in terms of both practice and understanding of poetry. So, yeah.
Well, on that note, you should go back and read your Coleridge. You should also consider books by all three of our poet critics. They're very different kinds of books engaging with the art critically, and I encourage you to get all three of them. Two other things I want to tell you before I let you go. This is a busy, exciting week here at the Library of Congress for Literature. Tomorrow, Halloween, also marks the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Nice.
We are going to have an epic all-day reading of the novel in the main reading room, the perfect place to be spooked out by some sort of hybrid humanoid form.
If you haven't been already.
This event will be live streamed on the library's social media channel, so you should definitely tune in if you can make it there. But we'd also love to see you this Friday. If you want to know what's happening with Uruguayan poetry, the Library of Congress is your place to go. You should come to the Will Pavilion across the street in the Jefferson Building at noon, and you can find out about it. Of course, you can sign up on our sign-up sheet. We'll send you information about it. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. Get some books, get them signed.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, guys.